I'm Elliot Chodoff, and welcome to Conflict Uncovered, your go-to podcast for in-depth analysis on the complex and dynamic conflicts shaping the Middle East, Israel, and the world. Join us as we delve into the latest developments, historical contexts, and the geopolitical forces at play. We bring you the insights you need to understand the issues that matter most. Stay informed, stay engaged, and uncover the truths behind the headlines. Hi, and welcome to Conflict Uncovered. I'm Elliot Chodoff. I'm joined again, still, my friend, colleague, Zev Uslan. How are we doing today, Zev?
We're doing well, Major. We're enjoying the ceasefire and still holding our breath as to when the other shoe may drop. What I'd like to talk about today and ask you is I'm getting very sophisticated feedback on our podcast, The Road to October 7th. And we've been covering history and the complexities of Israeli military and the dynamics leading up to October 7th. And I'd really appreciate continuing to explore that because speaking as an American Israeli, people are still very complex and look for simple answers. And I think what's being demonstrated during our discussions is there ain't no simple answers. So I'm looking forward to what you have to say.
Okay, thanks. In this case, there are no simple answers, and we talked a bit in our first discussion about this. The drive to simple answers leads to conspiracy theory, because that gives a simplistic answer. The other alternative, in rather than conspiracy theory, is labeling. In other words, saying it was because of this, and put a label on it, whether it's hubris or whatever, and say this is the cause. And there's a problem with that because, once again, when a system fails, it's very, very difficult. It may happen, but typically a simple label doesn't explain the failure of a system, and it certainly doesn't explain the failure of an otherwise successful system that has a record of success. In other words, somewhere you've got to look at where did things change? Did they change precipitously, or is there sort of a gradual slide that takes us to where we got to? And I believe it was a gradual slide with interlocking and intertwined pieces. And that's the road that I think we need to travel. I've talked about two periods in the history of the IDF. The period I called the wars up until 1982, and then the period after that of not wars. And before we move to the second period, there are just a couple of other points I want to make about the first period that sort of set us up to go into the next one. One that we haven't talked about is the reserve component of the IDF. When the War of Independence ended, the leadership, Ben-Gurion in particular, understood that Israel could not maintain a standing army on the size that it needed in order to deal with emergencies. And his solution, which wasn't a unique one, Switzerland operates this way as well, countries that perceive threat, although maybe the reason Switzerland has never been invaded aside from the Alps is because they perceive the threat.
Just a little interesting point about Switzerland is that they have the most highly developed bomb shelters in the world, luxury bomb shelters, which is very interesting given the vanguard of the Pope's Swiss Guard.
Again, you're supporting the point that perhaps one of the reasons they're not invaded is because they are so prepared for invasion. And again, the Alps help, obviously. So what Ben-Gurion basically instituted, and the army instituted, was a reserve system that basically said that when you finished your regular service, you went into the reserves, and you continued to serve in the reserves until, in those days, it was until age 55, 54. And you got called up regularly. In other words, it was known if you were in the reserves, you would do roughly a month of reserve duty a year, some of it in training, some of it in the line filling gaps. In other words, there were areas of regular service, line service, that were relegated to the reserve units that rotated through, which took pressure off the regular army and allowed the regular army also to train. Because here we also have to keep in mind, uh, we talk about the regular army with all due respect. I call them the kids for good reason, because they're between 18 and 21 years old. But the regular army, at least half of it, is not yet ready to fight. These are, if they're doing 3 years service or 2.5 years service, uh, the people in their first year are still in training and learning the ropes. So the reserve component added a fully trained, experienced component to the regular army, and it was folded in on a regular basis. And of course, in emergencies, and I think the great illustration of it was the 6-Day War. During the period before the 6-Day War, there was a month-long crisis that led to the 6-Day War that actually for 3 weeks was a clear crisis when the Arab army started to move toward Israel's borders. The reserves were called up, and there were fantastic newsreel videos, movies. People didn't have cell phones in those days. Most people didn't have telephones in those days. And the call-up was done by over the radio. The news would come on the hour. And everybody who's been to Israel in those days knows the news would start with beeps, boop, 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 boop. And then here's the news. And the news would begin with the IDF is announcing the following, and they would read the codes of the units. Everybody had a call-up code. It was a 2-word code. And people would gather around the person with the radio, transistor radio on the street corners. And as they're reading the codes over the radio, one person walks away and another person walks away. And they called up the reserves. In 1973, when the war broke out, Yom Kippur, the reserves were called up, and the reserves became a major component. I should go back. 1967, the paratroop brigade that took the old city of Jerusalem was a reserve brigade. The brigade that masked the city, the armored brigade that masked the city and ultimately took Jericho, was a reserve brigade. In Yom Kippur, Ariel Sharon's division that crossed the canal was a reserve division. So I can give other examples, but I think it's important to understand that the reserve component was a full partner component in the IDF through the period of the 50s and 60s and 70s and into 1982. That's number one. The downside to it, of course, was that it was costly in terms of the economy. And when you're doing reserve duty, you're not earning anything in the economy. You're also not earning anything from the army. You don't get paid for reserve duty in Israel. You don't get pension benefits for reserve duty in Israel. But there is a cost to it. And that becomes part of the thinking that we'll come to in the post-1982 period. Again, that'll lead us to October 7th. Next, I want to illustrate, I talked about the unprofessionalism in the Army, and I want to give just one point of illustration. And that is that the Armored Corps and the Israeli Tank Corps, as you know, is renowned these days with arguably, if not the best tank in the world, the Merkava Mark IV, certainly in the running for the best tank in the world. Up until 1964, the Israeli Army Armored Corps was a third-rate operation. And the guy who turns it around, and I want to come back to something I mentioned, although he wasn't Palmach, he was Haganah, the importance of the individual in a system that is not institutionalized. The individual here was a general named Israel Tal, who was at the time, chief armored officer in 1964. Just as an aside, Tal is recognized worldwide as a genius in tank warfare. In the Patton Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky, Tal's picture hangs between Patton and Rommel, which is not a bad place to be in the pantheon of tank commanders. And in 1964, there was a period of skirmishing with the Syrians. I don't want to go into the history of it, but the Israeli tanks were not hitting their targets. They were not hitting the Syrian tanks. They were firing and missing. And it was to the point of catastrophe. The Syrians were hitting and the Israelis were missing. And Tal, who was the chief armor officer, investigated. He found out something very interesting and very simple that he didn't know. And that was that the tank guns were being zeroed, in other words, set to zero on their sights, by the crews themselves. There was no standard for doing it. And at medium to long range, if your zeroing is not perfect, you miss your target. And he instituted that all tank guns have to be zeroed by professional armorers whose sole job is to zero the guns on the sights of the tanks. And suddenly, in no time, they start hitting the Syrian tanks. And he instituted the institutionalization of the Armored Corps in 1964. By the way, he was also the father of the Merkava tank. It was his design. So the importance of the individual, and from there, of course, increased institutionalization, but it shows how even as late as 1964, we're talking about a ragtag kind of operation that only gets zeroed, if you will, by the intervention of an individual. With that, I want to shift gears. I want to move from the period of the wars to the post period of the wars. And before I do that, I just want to point something out about this division into periods. When I talk about the periods, this is my separation into two. It's a retrospective. It's an analytical separation. In other words, unlike World War II, that when it ends, everybody knows World War II is over. The Germans have surrendered. The Japanese have surrendered. It's over. And we are now in the post-war period. And America demobilizes and sends some 9 million men and women in uniform home. And they take off their uniforms. And most of them never put them on again except for parades and some who get called up for the war in Korea. When the Soviet Union collapses, we're in the post-Cold War period. There's a cataclysmic event that marks the end of a period. What we're talking about here is something different. In 1982, 1983, 1984, and so on, nobody knows that we have gone into the period of non-war. It's only looking back now that I can say, one of the things that characterizes the period from 83 to 2023 is that there is no large-scale war of maneuver of large unit operations in the IDF. Okay, the closest thing to it, as we mentioned before, was 2006, the war with Hezbollah, but that was very, very minor, very, very limited. So we're moving into a different period. What happens in the 80s and 90s on the ground is a settling into a military status quo because Egypt makes peace in 1979. It was the greatest neighbor enemy of Israel and the greatest concern of the IDF is taken out of the picture. And by 1982, 1983, Israel has withdrawn from Sinai. The Sinai Peninsula is demilitarized. The Southern Command, which had been the primary command facing Egypt, now fades a bit into the background because the great threat has been removed. It's still there kind of in theory, even to this day, but it's removed in the sense of 1956, 1967, 1973, Egypt is the enemy. And now it's a shadow. Relations with Jordan are improving, and by the mid-1990s, we have a peace treaty with Jordan. Syria is still a threat, but has never been a freestanding threat to Israel. I'm talking about now in the period of the 80s and 90s. It was always known that Syria would only go to war if Egypt went to war. Lebanon was not an issue, and the Lebanese issue, which had been the PLO, was eliminated in 1982. They were driven out, the leadership moved to Tunis, and Hezbollah, although it's already in the field in the 80s and 90s, is not yet recognized as the threat that it's going to develop into that we're facing today on the scale that we're facing. Iran of that period of the 80s is in a war with Iraq. Two other enemies, potential enemies, engaged with each other. And Israel in general, and the IDF in particular, go into this kind of almost peace phase. Now, not peace in the political sense. We talked last time about war as a state of affairs. Peace is a state of affairs, but peace in the superficial sense. All the major threats have essentially been reduced. And when we go into the 90s, we can add the fact that Iraq has gotten beaten up in the Gulf War of 91. We took Scud missiles during that war, but after that, Saddam is greatly constrained by sanctions. Okay, so that's kind of the geopolitical situation around Israel, and the army is in a position for the first time, really in its history, where it can stop and take a deep breath and say, I'm really not under immediate pressure on a grand scale anymore. And that leads us into the 90s, where a few things happen simultaneously. The first is that the IDF, for the first time in its history, comes in contact with academia and social science.
Oh,
Now,
I'm sorry.
I mentioned
that is
yes,
you.
as two social scientists, we can commiserate. Israeli officers, as I mentioned previously, tend to be undereducated for their positions relative to European and American. And a result of that has always been a lag in contact with the academic world. I know that when I went to the IDF in 1984, after already doing graduate work, I was looked upon as a very, very strange kind of character. You know, when I went in for induction, I was asked in an interview, "How many years of education do you have?" And I said 21, and the scale only said 12. The interviewer, she didn't know what to do with it, so she checked off 12, and she said, "What did you do after 12?" Okay, which was kind of amusing for a variety of reasons, and again, too involved to get into here. The IDF meets up with, for all intents and purposes, I'm going to sort of crystallize this, industrial psychology. And industrial psychology is a very important field, has nothing to do with the military. And I say this as a military sociologist. And one of the things that we were adamant about in military sociology is that you need to understand the military institution as a military institution it's not just an organization. It has aspects of other organizations, as all organizations do. But it is very, very, very different. And as my advisor in graduate school, Morris Janowitz, the founder of military sociology, who had been an officer in Eisenhower's headquarters in World War II, one of the many, many brilliant things that he said was, one of the thing that makes being in the military different from any other job in the world is that you can do everything right and get killed. And it's almost trite, but it gives an idea of how very different military is from other things. And just to elaborate that point, you can get killed doing lots of other jobs. There are other dangerous jobs out there, but invariably, it's if something goes wrong. In other words, even in policing, which has its dangers, serious dangers, a police officer being killed or injured is the result of some sort of something wrong happening. Something procedurally was not done correctly, and that is the consequence. In the military, getting killed is part of the process. And when you see things that way, you begin to realize that this is a different type of a system. Once again, oversimplifying, but importantly oversimplifying, the two hallmarks of industrial psychology, or the central hallmark, let's put it that way, is efficiency. Industrial psychology is about making the system efficient. It takes many things correctly for granted in industry, and it says, okay, if we take all those other things for granted, what we need to do is do it as efficiently as possible. Production, whatever. When you apply that to the military, you get the exact opposite outcome than you need from the military organization. And here in Israel, I've spoken about this in the IDF, and I've given some lectures in the IDF. Here in Israel, we have a double problem. Not only is there a general misunderstanding of the difference between efficiency and a much more important concept called effectiveness. I'll come back to that in a moment. In Hebrew, we only have one word for both concepts.
Which
is
the
Hebrew word ye'ilut, which means efficient, but is used for both, efficient and effective. And not only are efficiency and effectiveness not the same thing, in many ways they're in conflict one with the other. You have to choose a hierarchy between the two. Do I want to be efficient as effectively as possible, or do I want to be effective as efficiently as possible? And I'll give you a simple example that I use when I'm teaching in the military. The efficiency question is, how many bullets did I use to kill as the number of enemy I killed? And efficiency says use the lowest number of bullets you possibly can. Effectiveness asks, how many enemy did I kill? And it doesn't matter how many bullets I fired. The military is wasteful. A successful military is wasteful by definition. And when you try to become more and more efficient, you begin to scale back. You don't build up stockpiles. Stockpiles are inefficient. And now we're already leading up to October 7th, the aftermath. The Israeli army ran out of ammunition in the aftermath of October 7th. It ran out of tank shells. It ran out of artillery shells. It ran out of aerial bombs. America supplied them in real time. That was part of the tremendous American aid in the aftermath of the 7th. By a year into the war, the IDF was firing shells and dropping bombs that it did not have on October 7th. It had used up its stores because it's inefficient to stockpile ammunition. ammunition has a use-by date. And if you don't use it, it degrades.
A brief question, a brief diversion.
Yes.
This time and previously, you had talked about Israeli industrial organizational psychologists advising the IDF and thus efficiency. But again, from ground level, these men and women all served in the IDF also here. So did they not have some sense of military reality?
Military reality, when you're not fighting a war, shrinks. Okay, ultimately, the system fails on logistics and logistical types of questions, and that's really where the efficiency comes in. If you're a combat soldier, let's take this to its extreme. Our hypothetical industrial psychologist was a combat soldier. And he knows, let's say he's a tankist, he knows he's got to have a tank with a full store of ammunition and a full tank of gas. He knows that. He also knows that when he needs it, a truck comes along and drops off his ammunition. A truck comes along and fills up his gas. He is not necessarily privy to the system that gets him the gas, just like when you go to the supermarket and you want to buy a bag of pitot, you don't think about the bakery. You don't think about where the flour came from. You don't think about where the grain came from to make the flour to get to the bakery. You don't think about how the ovens are fired. You don't think about how the baking is done, the packaging, the shipping, and how it gets to the store on the same day that it was baked or the day after it was baked. I mean, have you ever thought about any of that when you pick up?
No, I just want to eat the stuff quickly.
That's right. And you want it to be there. You also don't care how much they throw out at the end of the day. You would not tolerate a system where you walked into the supermarket repeatedly. It could happen periodically, right? But repeatedly at 3:00 in the afternoon, and there were no more breads on the shelf. You'd say, bake more. And if they came back and said, well, if we bake more, we're going to have to throw some out, your answer to them is, that's your problem. It's not mine. Right? And if it happened repeatedly, you'd go to a different supermarket. Well, in the Army, you can't go to a different logistics arm. You got to deal with what you got. Okay, now, during the period of wars, that was blatantly obvious to the powers that be. In other words, the system, not the soldier on the ground. The system knew. And by the way, there were problems on Yom Kippur during the Yom Kippur War because there had already begun to be breakdowns in the logistical system. Okay. Suddenly, the Yom Kippur War was a much higher intensity war than the 6-Day War. In other words, its appetite was much greater over a slightly longer period of time. The 6-Day War, big surprise, was 6 days. The Yom Kippur War was 3 weeks. And the system had a hard time maintaining itself. That's why the American resupply was so important. Okay. That takes us into the 90s and the efficiency push. Another aspect of it, and I'm going to conclude with this, was that in industrial psychology, and once again, I admittedly oversimplify, if you're going to look at a single variable in a system, typically what's looked at is work accidents, industrial accidents. That's the statistical variable that gives you a sense of the health of the organization, of the industry. Because accidents in industry show poor training, poor discipline, poor maintenance of equipment, perhaps. It tells you a lot of things about the system, poor management, that if you can reduce the number of industrial accidents, it means that you've dealt with a myriad of issues in making the system better. Usually there's not a single cause to an industrial accident. What they decided was that the equivalent category in the IDF was training accidents. And training accidents became a variable by which not only was the system measured, but commanders were measured in terms of their promotion ratings. In other words, if you wanted to be promoted, you needed to reduce the number of training accidents. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. First of all, there's a basic rule, and we all know this. You study for the test. If I tell you the test is going to be on chapter 4, but I want you to read chapters 1 through 6, you're going to read chapter 4.
Wait, were you watching my graduate degrees? What? How'd you know this?
We all know this. If I tell you these are the criteria by which you're going to be measured, but I expect you to do twice as much, you're not going to do twice as much. You're going to do what you're going to be measured on. Now, let me ask you a question. I know you're a clever guy.
Or is this pass fail or am I getting graded?
It's pass fail. No. If I tell you as a commander, you're going to be evaluated on the number of training accidents over the coming year, what is the easiest way to reduce training accidents to 0?
I know the answer. Train less.
Or don't train at all.
Or don't train.
Well, you can't do that because it's already on your program. So what do you do instead? Make your training unrealistic, because combat training is dangerous. I use those 2 points to show the beginning of what I'm going to call rot that goes into the system. It stops being a true military system and becomes a more bureaucratic industrial system. And I'll add one point to that I'm going to pick up on next time, and that is armies are designed for combat. There's a very interesting book written by a retired British general about 20 years ago. He said, armies do 2 things. They kill people and destroy objects. If you don't want people killed and objects destroyed, don't use the army for it. I'll expand on that and say, if an army's raison d'etre, it exists to fight in combat. In combat will give you the measure of the army. But what happens if there is no combat? Now we're in the post-combat period without knowing it, but it's there. We're not in combat. How do you measure the army? And the answer is you have to create artificial measures. You have to work very, very hard, and this was not done because you need a tremendous amount of professional knowledge to do this. How do you create measures that correctly reflect the Army's ability to engage in combat? Since the measures are artificial, how do you test them? How do you measure them? How do you design them? And make sure that what you're measuring is actually relevant to the Army's raison d'etre, which is to perform well in combat. So I'm gonna end with that. Next time we're going to go from the 90s forward. There are a number of other things that happened in the 90s that are very important, some of which I was peripherally involved in. And that will take us up and further along the road, at least to October 7th.
Elliot, thank you very much. You've given a lot of valuable history, knowledge, and unfortunately for those of us who are simple-minded, rich complexity to understanding a very important time in our history. Thank you very much.
You're welcome very much. To our listeners, thanks for being with us. As always, stay safe, stay engaged. Until next time.